Ladies and gentlemen, when a narcissistic man hurts a good woman, what unsettles him most is not the pain he caused, it's the moment he realizes he no longer has access to her emotional world. Narcissism is fundamentally about control, not connection. He needs to know that her moods, her self-doubt, her hope, and even her distress still orbit around him, as long as her emotional energy is tethered to his reactions, his approval, his withdrawal, his occasional kindness. He feels powerful. That emotional dependency reassures the fragile structure of his self-esteem. But something shifts when a good woman begins to detach internally. She may still be polite, she may still speak calmly, yet her emotional reactions no longer spike or collapse in response to him. This is deeply threatening because it signals that his influence is fading. From a psychological standpoint, narcissistic individuals regulate their sense of self externally. They need to evoke emotion in others to feel real. When her reactions flatten, not out of numbness but out of clarity, the supply dries up. Philosophically, this is where the imbalance corrects itself. Control requires participation. Manipulation needs an audience. The moment she stops emotionally auditioning for him, the dynamic collapses. He may escalate through guilt, charm, anger, or nostalgia, not because he loves her, but because he fears losing that emotional leverage. Her calm becomes intolerable because it exposes the truth. He was never the center of her strength, only a distraction from it. And here's the most important part. This shift doesn't require confrontation or explanation. It happens internally. When a good woman reclaims her emotional autonomy, she rewrites the power dynamic without saying a word. She becomes self-directed, emotionally sovereign, and unreachable in the way that matters most to him. Because when he can no longer control how she feels, he is forced to face what he has avoided all along. His power was never real, and her freedom always was. What a narcissistic man fears even more than a woman's anger is her clarity. Anger to him is still useful. It signals engagement, emotional investment, and the possibility of reaction. Anger can be provoked, redirected, minimized, or weaponized. But clarity is different. Clarity means she understands the pattern. She sees the manipulation, not as isolated incidents, but as a system. And once that understanding settles in, it fundamentally changes the terrain of the relationship from a psychological perspective. Narcissistic behavior relies on confusion, gaslighting, blame shifting, intermittent reinforcement. These tactics only work when the other person is questioning their own reality. A good woman's clarity collapses that confusion. She no longer argues about details, intentions, or fairness. She recognizes the behavior for what it is, regardless of the excuse attached to it. That recognition strips his narratives of their power. He can no longer reframe himself as misunderstood, wounded, or justified because she is no longer trying to convince him or herself of anything. Philosophically, clarity represents a return to truth. And truth is destabilizing to a narcissistic structure built on distortion. When she stops seeking emotional resolution from him, she also stops granting him authority over meaning. Her silence is not avoidance, it is discernment. Her distance is not punishment, it is alignment with reality. That is why clarity feels like rejection to him. It removes his role as the interpreter of events, the one who defines what happened and why it mattered. And here is the quiet power in this shift. Clarity does not announce itself. It doesn't argue, it doesn't plead, it simply changes behavior. When a good woman acts from understanding rather than emotion, the dynamic ends, even if the relationship technically continues for a while. Because once you see clearly, you cannot unsee, and once you stop explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you, you reclaim your freedom. What a narcissistic man fears more than confrontation is exposure that happens without accusation. He often assumes that if a good woman doesn't speak out, doesn't explain herself publicly, doesn't tell her side of the story, then he remains safe. But that assumption misunderstands how exposure actually works. True exposure isn't always loud. Often it's quiet and far more damaging. Psychologically, narcissism depends on image management. The persona he presents to the world must remain intact, charming, misunderstood, impressive, victimized. He relies on others, especially the woman he hurt, to help maintain that illusion, either by defending him, staying silent in a way that looks like loyalty, or appearing diminished after the relationship ends. When she begins to thrive instead, The narrative shifts without her saying a word. Her healing becomes evidence. Her confidence becomes contrast. When people observe that she is calmer, stronger, more grounded, and no longer emotionally entangled, the question arises naturally, what happened here? And that question is terrifying to someone who survives on control of perception. He cannot easily smear what he can no longer reach. He cannot discredit growth that is consistent and quiet. Philosophically, this kind of exposure is rooted in truth revealing itself over time. Reality doesn't require advocacy. It reveals patterns through outcomes. When a good woman aligns her life with her values, peace, stability, self-respect, she becomes a living counterpoint to his version of events. Her progress doesn't accuse him, but it does illuminate the cost of being close to him. This is why her silence unsettles him. Not because she is hiding, but because she is no longer participating in the performance. He loses his mirror, he loses his audience, and most unsettling of all, he loses the ability to control how the story lands. Because when your life speaks for you, you don't need to explain. And choosing your healing over proving your pain is the most powerful form of truth there is. What a narcissistic man fears at a deep, almost existential level is becoming emotionally irrelevant. Narcissism is not sustained by love, it is sustained by impact. Being admired, feared, needed, argued with, or even resented still confirms existence. As long as he can provoke an emotional response, he knows he matters. That's why conflict can feel invigorating to him. It reassures him that he still occupies space in someone else's inner world. But Hen, a good woman stops responding emotionally. Something far more threatening happens. She doesn't fight. She doesn't plead. She doesn't try to be understood. She simply disengages. Psychologically, this removes the feedback loop he depends on to regulate his self-worth. Without her reactions, he has no emotional mirror. And without a mirror, the fragile sense of self he maintains begins to destabilize. This is why indifference is often misinterpreted as cruelty. It isn't. It's neutrality. And neutrality is intolerable to someone who needs emotional charge to feel alive. A narcissistic man would rather be hated than forgotten, because hatred still acknowledges relevance. Emotional irrelevance, on the other hand, is annihilating. It suggests that he is no longer central, no longer influential, no longer significant in her life. From a philosophical perspective, this is where power truly shifts. Influence is not maintained through dominance, but through consent. When a good woman withdraws that consent, when she stops orienting her emotional life around him, his power dissolves. He may attempt to reinsert himself through nostalgia, provocation, or sudden vulnerability, not because he seeks connection, but because he cannot tolerate disappearance. And this is the quiet truth many women underestimate. You don't have to defeat a narcissistic man. You don't have to expose him or confront him or make him understand. You only have to remove him from the center of your emotional universe. Because the moment he no longer matters to you is the moment you matter fully to yourself. And that is where real freedom begins. What a narcissistic man fears profoundly is not that a good woman will realize she deserves better. It's that she will actually believe it. For a long time, her self-worth may have been questioned, negotiated, or slowly eroded through criticism, comparison, and conditional affection, but it was never destroyed. It was paused. And when she begins to reclaim it, the entire dynamic shifts in ways he cannot control. Psychologically, narcissistic relationships function by keeping the other person slightly off balance. A good woman is often generous, reflective, and willing to self-correct. He exploits those traits, encouraging her to doubt herself while positioning himself as the standard she must meet. When she reclaims her self-worth, she no longer asks, "What did I do wrong?" She asks, "Why am I tolerating this?" That single shift is destabilizing because it removes his authority as the judge of her value. As her self-worth strengthens, her behavior changes. She stops over-explaining. She stops chasing closure. She enforces boundaries without hostility and walks away without theatrics. From the outside, it may look subtle, but to him, it is seismic. The behaviors he relied on, minimizing, withholding, provoking, no longer yield results. He cannot bargain with someone who knows their worth, and he cannot intimidate someone who is no longer afraid of being alone. Philosophically, Reclaiming self-worth is an act of returning to oneself. It is the decision to live from internal values rather than external validation. This is deeply threatening to someone whose entire identity is built on being above others. Her wholeness exposes his emptiness, not through accusation, but through contrast. And this is the part many women miss her self-worth doesn't punish him. It simply makes him irrelevant to her sense of value. She no longer needs his approval to feel complete. Because when you stop asking someone to recognize your worth and start honoring it yourself, you don't just change the relationship, you end the illusion that kept you trapped in it. What a narcissistic man fears most, when all is said and done, is that a good woman will never look back. Not in anger, not in longing, not even in curiosity. The finality of that is profoundly unsettling to him because narcissistic dynamics are built on the assumption of return for closure, return for explanation, return for validation. He assumes that no matter how much damage was done, she will eventually re-enter the orbit to make sense of it all. Psychologically, this fear is tied to object permanence and entitlement. Many narcissistic individuals unconsciously believe that people remain emotionally available to them indefinitely. Even after separation, they expect to exist as a reference point in her mind. When a good woman fully closes the door internally, not just physically, she violates that assumption. He can no longer access her for reassurance, nostalgia, or ego repair. The line is not just crossed, it disappears. This is why attempts to pull her back often intensify when she truly moves on. It isn't love resurfacing, it's panic. Her absence forces him to confront something he works tirelessly to avoid, that he is not irreplaceable, not unforgettable, not central to her future. Her forward motion confirms that the chapter is closed, and not ceremonially, but existentially, philosophically. Not looking back is an act of self-trust. It means she no longer needs to revisit the pain to validate it. She no longer needs his acknowledgement to justify her leaving. She accepts that some endings do not offer resolution, only release. And in choosing not to look back, she affirms that her life is not defined by what she survived, but by what she chose afterward. This is the ultimate loss of control for him and the ultimate reclaiming of power for her, because when you stop turning around to see if someone notices your absence, you finally arrive fully in your own life, and that is where healing becomes irreversible. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe, my friends.